Look, I hate to do this to you all, but I just want to put Barbara Woodward on screen because
With her irenic facial disposition.
she's delightful, isn't she?
Mm.
On February the 24th, she said Russia invaded Ukraine, an act of aggression and clear violation of international law. This was yesterday, which the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to condemn. Since then, the Russian Federation's repeatedly spread disinformation, including wild claims involving dirty bombs, chemical weapons, and offensive biological research. How much more of this nonsense do we have to endure? And that is my question. How much more of the British governments and Barbara Woodward's and all the rest of the mouthpieces,
Mm.
how much more of this nonsense do we have to endure?
Quite.
Well, I mean,
And
what's
when we
extraordinary
get back
from,
to
sorry.
people like Sir Emma Jones Parry, who was the first British Secretary General to the UN, I remember, with his dulcet tones and his peaceful ways. How much more of the nonsense of Barbara Woodward do we have to endure? And
Yes.
before her, it was that fuller figure lady who had the delightful manner when she read the script about that was during the attempts to get the Western Allies to bomb Syria outright in 2013. Remember when she read, "Britain has deployed Storm Shadow missiles." We could do without that kind. But sorry, Vanessa, go on.
No, I mean, it's just extraordinary, isn't it? We saw this in Syria, this constant sort of aggressive warmongering stance. But what is extraordinary is that Russia, despite the confrontation with NATO member states, tried to reach out to what they assumed would be the more reasonable parties within the governments of the UK, France, and the US in order to discuss with them the potential of the use of a dirty bomb, which would have devastating consequences on the surrounding environment and civilians. On the basis, this to me demonstrates, and from working with Russia, I know this very well, this demonstrates this kind of honorable side of Russia, where it still believes in the concept of diplomacy and discussion, right? And unfortunately, in the West, what do we see? We see a ridiculing, and we've seen this for decades now. We've seen a ridiculing of this honorable approach, this respectful approach, and also this desire from Russia to actually prevent any kind of nuclear use at all, right? Rather than what we see is this dismissal of this potential threat. Why? Of course, in my view, because British intelligence in particular is behind all of these terrorist activities that are being carried out
Mm.
by the Kiev regime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Patrick?
Mike, you put that Barbara Woodward quote back up on screen. Torture everybody a little bit more. Everything she's mentioning there is funny. She's talking about chemical weapons. She's talking about nukes, dirty bombs, biolab research. Biolab research is a fact. There's
Yeah.
multiple offensive bio research labs that were exposed in Ukraine, funded by the Defense Threat Agency under the Pentagon Department of Defense. That's beyond any debate. And then chemical weapons. The UK and the US were bringing up this specter of Russia unleashing chemical weapons in Ukraine. That was from the very beginning, from the off at the beginning of March. And then the nuclear talking point constantly. Putin's going to lash out if he thinks he's losing and unleash tactical nuclear weapons. So Russia said there's a dirty bomb plot afoot, a false flag, perhaps, or something to create some kind of radiological exclusion zone in some key area to disrupt the trajectory of the conflict there in Zaporizhia or Kherson or something like that. So, I mean, Russia is bringing that out. They're getting out in front of that potential issue there, in their eyes anyway. And the West is the visceral reaction from
Mm.
Western politicians, almost like Putin spoiled the party or something. But Alex quoted Bradbury's 451 Fahrenheit, so I'll quote Orwell: "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." That I see when I
Mm.
see Barbara Woodward's statement there, I just think of that Orwell quote because it's just that's where we're at right now. There's the disconnect is unbelievable, and I think part of it is because a lot of our elected representatives they're just not very well informed. They don't have a grasp of all the issues very well, and they're marinated in their own propaganda for a very long time. So that there's a complete disconnect with reality with most of our elected representatives. They're not able to be informed. Look at how bad the
people want-
mainstream media is. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
If people want weekend listening on Russia, Ukraine more generally, 2 fresh interviews I'd recommend. One is if you go to tntradio.live and then find the Hrvoje Moric show, which is Hrvoje is his first name. John Helmer is the veteran Australian foreign correspondent in Moscow. He's been there since just before the fall of communism. And of course, he was the main Western eyewitness to a lot of the courtroom dramas, such as the Litvinenko and the Skripal episodes. And like others I could mention who are Russia watchers from Australia, I find them particularly clear-sighted about this. So listen to John Helmer giving his recent interview on the Hrvoje Moric show, which is part of TNT, where he talks about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station being, quote, a dirty bomb pointed at France and Germany. And I dare say the Netherlands, where I'm sitting here, it's all in the same wind direction from the Ukraine. So a second Chernobyl. So he's not sensationalist at all, as Helmer, but listen to a man who spent 35 years basically watching these things. And I don't know if Vanessa wants to come in, but before I forget the other thing, it would be an interview just posted a few hours ago on the Dutch political parties YouTube channel, Forum for Democracy. I think FVD International is the variant. You'll find it easily enough. It's John Laughland, Laughland, giving a guest lecture on the Russia-Ukraine war. And again, a long-term Russia watcher with international law expertise living in Paris.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I love John Laughland. Of course, very involved in the Milosevic trial, about which he wrote. I would also recommend Andrei Martyanov, who is on YouTube under Smoothie, SMOOTHIE, Big X12. But he also has a blog, he's just spoken very eloquently and very sort of soberly about the potential for the dirty bomb. And there are a couple of others. There's Big Surge, SERGE on Substack, who's also excellent. But yeah, John Laughland, thank you for that, Alex. I'll check that out, actually. I missed it.
Alex, what was one of the things that was interesting was that the Russians over the last week or so have been specifically singling out the UK as being the major Western partner with Ukraine in pursuing this dirty bomb tactic. Is that something you find credible?
Perfect. I rubbed shoulders with the Portland Down crowd and the MI6 Russia desk, and they're not all bad guys, but there were some questionable characters within them. And the well-known Russian MOD briefer, the same guy who talks about Russia's military involvement in Syria, was talking earlier this year about Portland Down, when the Biolab Ukraine story really first became mainstream, already wagging the finger at MOD level, but this is government-wide level now that they're talking about this. Just about a month ago or less, there was also one of the Russian MOD people being quoted as saying that at least in Zaporizhzhia, one of the 4 oblasts that's now voted to join Russia, nothing happens on the ground without a British commander being consulted, is the quotation being given. And it wasn't just a blanket claim. This was the case in the whole of the, we could say broader Donbass. Technically, Donbass is only Donetsk and Lugansk, but the eastern fringe of Ukraine. No, it was specifically in that oblast, as if there's been, as with the Baltic states, a kind of divvying up among the keenest Western allies that you take one each. So Zaporozhye in particular, Britain seems to be in control. And of course, that is the very oblast where the nuclear power station is. So it all horribly congeals in something that makes sense to me, actually. That London could write the script, as BBC Ukrainian says, with its distinctive style and content. Local hotheads could deliver it, because I was a CBRN, so the Weapons of Mass Destruction officer, as a sort of double-hatted role when I was at GCHQ, and the whole spiel we got was the Brits and Yanks, but particularly the Brits, are on top of the world in this game, and a dirty bomb or equivalent in chemical and biological terms probably will never be used in anger by a state, but will be used by a bunch of irregulars. But the subtext was, never spoken out loud, is that the irregulars will be somebody's glove puppet.
And I think it goes without saying, just to add to that, I think it goes without saying, you could detonate or launch anything like that, whether it's even if it's an industrial accident, it will be blamed on Russia immediately. The entire global media will be in lockstep, and all the politicians in NATO countries will be in lockstep on message, and they will blame Russia. It doesn't matter who's responsible. It doesn't matter how much evidence there is, or how much the blogosphere, how much we dig up on Twitter and show the actual truth. That doesn't matter. What matters is that narrative will be unified, and they will then build policy immediately on the back of that. They'll escalate on the back of that before
Just
any
God forbid, but
investigation.
I'm foreseeing this. I'm foreseeing this. The first Sunday after such a thing happens, God forbid, I'm seeing this sort of the popularized level of this in my own sphere, which is churches. I can imagine a lot of ministers and elders saying, "Oh Lord, strike Putin down for the dirty bomb he's launched."
Also timing-wise, we're coming up to November the 11th, which for the West is a symbolic time of year. So I don't know. I mean, I think particularly because Ukraine now is effectively losing thousands of men. It's bogged itself down in an untenable position militarily. It knows that the Russian reservists are heading to the front line after training. And it knows that Russia is looking forward to the winter because this is Russia's, strong point. This is when Russia becomes virtually undefeatable. And so I think there's a very small window of opportunity to create this false flag. And I think you need to be looking at the dates that are going to be symbolic to the West for the release of some kind of false flag.
So Patrick, if what you're saying is correct, although Russia has got out ahead of this and has made a big deal about it and made all the telephone calls and now has held this meeting in the Security Council, which was not in public, it wasn't a public meeting, by the way. But what we're talking about here, what you highlighted there, is that the media is so locked down that there's no opportunity for any counter narrative to get any traction whatsoever. I just want to remind everybody how that has happened, because this is a British policy again, brought to the G7. Theresa May brought it in June 2018, called the Rapid Response Mechanism. The G7 agrees to have a common narrative, and of course that common narrative expands out beyond the G7 as well. It is impossible, therefore, for anybody to push or to find any discussion of any alternative explanations in the mainstream media at all.
Another date that's coming up, which...
Sorry, Alex, Patrick first, yeah.
Yeah, Mike, I think Russia, again, has pulled a blinder diplomatically by getting out in front of it. And although this can be muted and controlled in a lot of the Western mainstream media, in terms of the wider global media, that message has gotten out. And there's been a lot of pushback, try and push back against Putin on this, a lot of Western journals and things like that, but they still have to report it. So they've done really well, considering the kind of media blackout that you're sort of alluding to there. But so there's two options. One is the West could, back a sort of provocation, stage provocation, or a false flag, and that would create the reaction that would ask for the solution from NATO, for instance. The other option would be a Saddam Hussein style. We have 50 intelligence agencies, and the intelligence community is resolute. Russia is planted. So that would be the two ways the West would want to frame any kind of escalation. So which one is easier? Which one has a lower cost? Which one can be managed or incrementally managed and things like that? Maybe the latter, actually. So it'll be interesting to see. Yeah.
And I think we saw this also with the Russian reporting on the potential for chemical weapons false flags in Idlib carried out by the White Helmets. Although the Western media dismissed it out of hand, we didn't actually have a staged chemical weapon attack. So I think that bears out what Patrick's just said. But it's also interesting the BBC is clearly increasing its social media coverage leading up to November. That job application was closed on October the 11th. So I think we need to start looking at that kind of thing also, because if the media is increasing its presence, it's preparing for a false flag, basically. And the
there's going to be somebody
BBC
on the
has
ground
to
saying,
be
I saw with my own eyes.
Yeah.
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 And John Helmer made this point at the end of his hour with Hrvoje Moric. Actually, the interview begins at 20 minutes in. That sometimes happens on TNT radio slots. So go straight to 20 minutes if you want to hear Helmer himself talking to Moric. But at the end of the hour, he says the dates he's looking at are mid-November, specifically the middle date, the 15th of the month, because that's exactly a week after the midterms. He reckons that the new Congress will have bedded down by then, and that both the White House and the newly reshuffled or rekaleidoscoped Congress will be thinking at this point, do we, on the Hill or in the White House, have confidence in the war machine, the Pentagon, to be continuing to use Zelensky? And we know that the Russian claim is Zelensky is throughout the year has said no at moments where negotiations with honor could have been on the table, and that's what would be behind one of these provocations if it happened, to make sure that to forestall yet another. Helmer says that another big indication to him, and he's been watching this a long time, that mid-November is the deadline for many of these things, is that there's a G20 meeting slated for then in Bali, if I remember correctly. Zelensky may be there in person as well as Putin in person. I don't know how that's going to work. All the Western heads of state and government who are in the G20 are meant to be there. Biden might be, with his handlers, making sure he doesn't wander off camera. He may be going there. And there's going to be, a lot to talk about. If the Brits have pulled a special just before that, God forbid, that would dominate the G20, wouldn't it? And that would produce a fait accompli. We can't talk peace and statesmanship because there's, some horrible dirty bombs just gone off.
Okay, so somebody in the chat box has said, is it not possible that Russia is pursuing that this whole thing is in fact a Russian false flag, in the sense that they're suggesting that the Russians are setting the West up in order to actually explode the dirty bomb themselves, and therefore deniability and all this kind of stuff. And I would say I want to get everybody's thoughts on this, but I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, we look at the countries around the world that have pursued this tactic, and Russia isn't at the top of the list. Britain, the United States, Israel, these types of countries, false flag after false flag after false flag, well documented, provable, we can show examples of it. But I can't see that Russia's anywhere in the top 10.
I think also you have to take into it that I agree that would have been my first point, but I also think what people forget in all of this is Russia's abhorrence towards war. 20 million dead in the Second World War at the hands of the Nazis. Russia, every time I've gone to Russia, every time I speak to Russians here, that is the overwhelming impression I get from them. They will avoid escalation at all costs. They will avoid civilian deaths at all costs. Now, you could argue, as Andrei Vlecek did in a very good article once, where he said, he basically said, I'm not saying Russia is, the white savior, the savior on the white horse, but they need humanity. They recognize that for humanity to survive, they need to preserve humanity. In the West, we've lost this underlying principle of why we're here. Humanity is dispensable in the West. We've seen that during COVID. We've seen it during all the wars that the West has instigated through false flags. So historically, Russia has not played the same card as the West.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
there are certainly pockets of... Oh, go on, Pat.
Yeah, just, how this is going to get framed is after the midterms, Democrats are going to lose the House of Representatives. Okay, they might lose the Senate. So the blame is going to be for domestic issues, mainly the economy. Okay, Biden will be thrown under the bus probably by his own party, and the first priority would be to start talking about how to replace him. In other words, yank him out of office, or make sure that if he does finish out his term by some miracle, that he won't be running again in 2024. That in the short term, that's where all of the energy and all the oxygen is going to be in Washington and in the United States. There'll be domestic turmoil. Might even be riots after the November 8th. So the question then is, if the GOP takes over Congress, is the appetite still there to write out these blank checks for Ukraine and push this proxy war even further and all the risks that go with it? And so, but the Ukraine issue and the anti-Russian issue is mainly a Democratic set piece. It's not naturally a Republican set piece. This is just an extension of 2016 Russiagate. So the policy and this over enthusiasm to back Ukraine politically in America, a lot of that's born out of Russiagate, and there's still Clinton. Okay, so then the question is, if that's the it would need the deep have to enter to create situation would
Right.
the Republicans back into touch.
Hold on a second. Patrick, Pat, you broke up there a second. Just tell us what the question is again.
So the question is, they would need to kick the GOP, the new Republican government, into touch to get them back on track, to back the Ukraine, to back the proxy war, so that you would need a provocation to do that, and that's been very successful in the past. They managed to strong-arm Donald Trump into a more strident policy against Syria by staging chemical weapons attacks, okay? And that caused the sort of the response by the U.S. and its allies. Okay, so this has been successful in the past in sort of molding domestic positions of government by using an external event and a staged provocation. Now, I will add one thing, and get ready for this. If that happens, then if you or me or anybody comes out and goes against the narrative that Russia unleashed some kind of a dirty bomb or is responsible for this, or if we blame any Western actors, we will be guilty of not just spreading Russian disinformation, but spreading Kremlin propaganda in a time of war. That's immediate cancellation, deleted, everything frozen, etc., sanctioned. Everyone becomes Graham Phillips at that point. So understand the seriousness of what's coming down the pipeline. They have laid the groundwork for the most egregious totalitarian authoritarian measures to control speech and discourse on this. There will be no room for dissent. It will not be tolerated. You will see the mob in full action on this, and that should scare the hell out of people.
Yeah. Alex?
For me, just very briefly then, I very much endorse what both Patrick and Vanessa just said, but the psychology of who let off a dirty bomb, God forbid, is not much different except in scale from a bunch of school children asking who passed wind, and the old saying, he who smelt it, dealt it, right? So sorry to use this trivial example, but that's the psychology at play. The one guy you don't suspect of having let off flatulence is the guy who says somebody is about to let off flatulence. That's in addition to that, the Russians have ways of being deceitful historically, but they don't involve this. They don't involve the classic false flag. There's much talk in the West about Maskirovka, using false forces or like the Allies did before D-Day. There's a lot of idle talk about desinformatia, disinformation, and about the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, which doesn't seem to be a doctrine at all, which is a rough equivalent of the Monroe doctrine. These are all Western talking points, but not even the West's talking point machine claims that the Russians have a track record of doing a classic false flag. Right? In fact, they had the opportunity with the Kachin massacre in the woods of Poland, didn't they? But it was in the West that this was talked about. Look at what the Nazis did. The Soviets, for the whole of the post-war Soviet history, 50 years, could have said, look at another of these egregious crimes of the fascists, but they didn't. They just shut up about it because they knew they'd done it. So even if they do something historically, and this changes at a glacial pace, the doctrine in the military high command in Russia, the attitude they have is not, let's pin this on our enemies, because they have high standards of intelligence themselves. They don't believe that the West would be as credulous as it maybe would be. Rather, they just shut up about it and hope it will go away.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's leave that discussion there. And Patrick, let's.